I'm Ron Schuhard, Goodrich C. White Professor of English and Irish Literature Emeritus. It's a great personal pleasure and privilege for me to open this wonderful occasion, not only for welcoming Maury and Catherine Heaney back to Emory for the launch of 100 poems, but for celebrating the immeasurable impact that Seamus Heaney and his family have had on the university, the Rose Library, and the lives of many students, faculty, and librarians over the last 38 years. Yes, 38. Seamus gave his first reading and class visit here in March 1981, and Maury accompanied him on numerous subsequent visits, not only to the Emory campus, but to major literary events and schools organized by Emory faculty in Ireland, at the Yates International Summer School in Sligo, and in England at Emory's British Studies program at Oxford University. Rich stories await to be told about all of them. Many lasting friendships got underway here and there, and many have enjoyed the Heaneys' boundless generosity and hospitality in their Dublin home on Strand Road. If they were lucky, they might find a glass of Guinness with some champagne poured in for a black velvet. Maury was born in Ardbow, County Tyrone, and grew up, Seamus told me, 200 yards from one of the most famous Celtic crosses in Ireland. She trained as a school teacher in Belfast, met Seamus the day they graduated from Teacher Training College in 1962, married in 1965, and became the parents of Michael, Christopher, and Catherine. She went on to work in broadcasting, journalism, and freelance writing, and took an MPhil in Anglo-Irish literature and folklore at University College Dublin, writing a thesis on the Honest Ulsterman, certainly one of the most important literary periodicals of the contemporary Irish literary movement, one that was conceived and launched in the Heaney home in Belfast in 1968 by writers known as The Group, of which Maury was a founding member, correspondent, host, and organizer. The papers of The Group, the journal, and its editor, Frank Ormsby, are now in the Rose Library. She later served as chairwoman, Seamus wanted everyone to know, of the Irish Women's Archive and Resource Center, which set up a database for retrieving the roles of women in the history of Ireland. The center also organized a major exhibition, Women, Famine, and Immigration, opened in Dublin Castle by President Mary Robinson. She has now edited 5 anthologies of Irish legends and Irish poetry. The first, Over 9 Waves, a book of Irish legends in 1994, is very dear to me. When I asked the Heaneys to help me bring some much-needed spirit and uplift to the Yates Summer School in the following year, Seamus readily came to open it, give a reading, and conduct the poetry workshop. And Maury, too, gave a mesmerizing tour de force reading of her retelling of the ancient Irish legends, one of the revitalizing highlights of the Yates School. Her most recent anthology is titled All Through the Night, Poems and Lullabies, including some elegies, compiled in memory of Seamus, and closing movingly with 3 famous lines from Hamlet. Now cracks a noble heart. Good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. Readers and recipients of Seamus's poems that were sent out as Christmas cards in special limited editions in the late 1980s and early 90s first meet Catherine as the young illustrator of such poems as The Settle Bed, Field of Vision, and I Sing of a Maiden, from a Middle English poem describing the virgin birth, illustrated by Catherine's drawing of a nativity scene when she was less than 4 years old. All are in the Rose Library. She went on to receive degrees from Trinity College Dublin and to become a freelance writer and editor, recently editing Trinity Tales, Trinity College, Dublin in the 90s, containing vivid and portraits of student life by graduates of the 90s. She previously worked as a literary editor at the London publishing houses of Fourth Estate and Faber, and directed the Creative Writing School for the Faber Academy. She is now a director of the Heaney Estate and works with publishers and various institutions to promote his works and poetry around the world. Let me briefly bring to this celebration some of the most momentous and memorable visits of Seamus and Maury to Emory, beginning with his inauguration of the Richard Ellman Lectures in Modern Literature. One member of the Emory faculty who welcomed Seamus on his first visit in March of '81 was the late Professor Richard Ellman, the great biographer and scholar of Yeats, Joyce, and Wilde, and Emory's first Woodruff professor, who came from Oxford to teach every spring from 1977 to his death in 1987. Emory President James Laney flew to Oxford during Ellman's final illness to tell him that the university wished to establish a major lecture series in his name. And when he asked him whom he would like to inaugurate them, he said immediately, Seamus. In honor of his friend, Seamus came to Emory with Maury in April 1988 on his 49th birthday to give the first 3 lectures published by Emory Scholars Press as the place of writing. There are still actually copies available upstairs in the special collections if you care to have one. There were some very festive Southern receptions and dinners after each lecture, including a pig roast with a mariachi band and a 3-tier margarita fountain. All of which inspired Seamus wearing an armadillo t-shirt and there he is in his armadillo t-shirt. In the spirit of the occasion, to recite some comic doggerel composed beforehand in a manuscript book titled A Horn Book for Ye Hog Days. But when the memorial part of the celebration called us to momentary reverence, Seamus read his elegy for Ellman, The Sounds of Rain, his first Emory poem printed in a limited edition. And Maury sang a beautiful Irish air. But the big moment was yet to come, in the library, at the end of his lectures, with Seamus surprisingly and fortuitously handing over to the library all of his manuscripts, typescripts, and correspondence related to the lectures in Ellman's memory. Dr. Linda Matthews, then Director of Special Collections, was so moved that she declared that the library should begin to build a contemporary Irish collection on this windfall gift. This was the generous act that, for the last 30 years, has led to the acquisitions that make up the great Irish archive that we have today. And Seamus's continuous support of the Ellman Lectures, helping us secure major international authors to deliver them, was instrumental in making the lecture series become one of the most prestigious in the English-speaking world today, to be given by the African-American poet Claudia Rankine in November. Before taking Seamus and Maury to the airport, we had time to drive over to Madison, Georgia, to show them the antebellum homes that Sherman did not burn. On the way, Seamus spotted the city limit sign for between Georgia and shouted, "Stop the car, we're in between." I've always been in between. I've got to have my picture here. And here it is. And here it is with words from a poem titled Terminus. 2 buckets were easier carried than one. I grew up in between. His in-betweenness between the north and south of Ireland, between Catholic and Protestant, between Ireland and England, and other polarities, eventually inspired a major literary conference titled Heaney's In-Between and an Epistemological Position for PhD Research. Truly. Seamus and Maury traveled the world together during the 1990s, a great team in the service of poetry, including the trip to Stockholm with their family for the Seamus's Nobel Prize in 1995. Their journey brought them to Emory several times as the Lowwater guests of President Bill Chase and his wife, Joanne, to read, visit classes, and see the growing Irish collections. Seamus's contributions to Emory over the years led President Chase to call the Heaneys back in May 2003 for Seamus to deliver the commencement address and receive an honorary degree. The English department's long-standing commitment, he said to the graduates and families on the quad, the commitment to the study and teaching of Irish literature, which I have experienced firsthand as a matter of friendship and scholarship of department members. That commitment gives extra significance to my own return to Emory this morning, as does the fact that Emory houses one of the greatest of literary archives. The holdings of the Robert W. Woodruff Library include the manuscripts and correspondence of some of the most significant poets of our time, and I am glad to say that in their special collections, Irish poets and poetry have enjoyed privileged status. Seamus had himself played a significant role in encouraging fellow poets to visit Emory, but he had not yet made a decision about his own papers. Over that summer, President Chase, publicly confirming his private decision to retire, invited Seamus and Maury to return for the retirement ceremony in September. No visit I've ever made here has been without great personal significance, he said in taking the podium. All in all, Emory has proved itself a home away from home for many writers. The audience was even stunned by his surprise announcement. When I was here this spring for commencement, I came to the decision that the conclusion of President Chase's tenure was the moment of truth, and that I should now lodge a substantial portion of my literary archive in Woodruff Library, including the correspondence from many of the poets already represented in special collections. So I am pleased to say that these letters are now here, and that even as President Chase is departing, they will be a memorial to the work that he has done to extend the university's resources and strengthen its purpose. What a moment. We have never stopped rejoicing. The presence of his papers here not only enhances our archival teaching and attracts international scholars for their study, they attract the archives of other writers who wish for their papers to be in the company of his. I remember Salman Rushdie saying on announcing the placement of his papers here, "If it's good enough for Seamus, it's good enough for me." Seamus and Maury were last here for the Rose Library's 12th night celebration in March 2013, when he gave one of his last readings in Glen Memorial before his sudden passing that August. In their mourning, Maury and Catherine and brother Christopher, with his wife Jenny and daughter Anna Rose, returned in October 2014 for the library's posthumous exhibition of Seamus's Emory papers, titled The Music of What Happens, a world-class exhibition that was subsequently expanded last July 2018 with Heaney's papers in the National Library of Ireland under the title Listen Now Again, both curated by Emory professor Geraldine Higgins, who will guide the conversation this evening. The exhibition in Dublin is ongoing, and awaits your arrival and viewing at the Bank of Ireland Culture Center in College Green. It'll be there for 2 more years before it will be moved permanently to the National Library of Ireland alongside the permanent exhibition of W.B. Yeats. While Geraldine curated, the Heaney family set about choosing these 100 poems. So you can see that, to Emory, all of the Heaneys are family. And in welcoming Mari and Catherine back for this celebration, we also welcome them home. Please join me.
Thank you, Ron, for that amazing Céad Míle Fáilte welcome and kick off to our evening of conversation with Mari and Catherine Heaney. As Ron says, we could not be happier to welcome them here to Emory, to the Irish Village. As he said, it's a phrase coined by the poet Eamon Grennan, and it really captures wonderfully the whole sort of array of Irish writers with their papers in conversation with each other, their friendships, their rivalries, their jokes, and their gossip. So it's just fantastic to have these writers all here. But of course, the chieftain of the Irish Village is Seamus Heaney. We could not have the collection that we do without his presence here, and it has, as Ron says, enriched all of our lives. It's also true, the idea of the Irish Village isn't an exclusive one. As our friend Bernard O'Donoghue used to say, we're all Irish in the sight of God. And many more people are trying to be in the sight of the passport authorities now, thanks to Brexit. But we're here this evening, as Ron so eloquently said, to celebrate the launch of this fantastic book, Seamus Heaney's 100 Poems. And I'm just going to start by asking Catherine to tell us a little bit about the origin of the book and how they approached the daunting task of whittling down the collections to just 100.
Wow. I just wanted to say before I start, it's so lovely to be here. I, unlike Mum, have only been to Emory once before, but nevertheless, it completely feels like a homecoming, as Ron said. Not to introduce a note of resentment early in the proceedings, but in 1988, I was living with Mum and Dad and one of my brothers in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I went to a rather overzealously academic high school who wouldn't let me take a week off school to come down here for the Elman lectures. So I'm making up for lost time. But yes, this book. So during Dad's lifetime, he had the idea of making a smaller selection of his poems. There are a couple of volumes of selected poems that he chose himself and that he did at various different points of his career. But as a result, they only go up to a certain point. And his publisher had the idea of maybe he would do 75 poems for his 75th birthday. And sadly, he didn't get to his 75th birthday, but he sort of also, I mean, I don't know how he would have done it. He was talking about doing 50 poems, which is crazy. We had a hard enough time getting it down to 100. But so when we revisited the idea, it just felt like a good moment because it would cover everything from start to finish, and it would be in one book that people who'd never read him before could come to and start and didn't have to choose which of 12 volumes they didn't know was the best one to begin with. And then for people who did, who already knew his work, it was like the greatest hits. So, but we all went off, all four of us, Mum and my two brothers, and we really just immersed ourselves in the poems. And that was, for me, that was a really interesting experience because while I know a lot of the poems incredibly well and I've known them all my life, I largely knew them through hearing them. I knew them through going to poetry readings as a child. I actually rarely sat down and took one of Dad's books and read it, and my brothers, if they were here, would back me up on that. But so it was really interesting, and particularly after he was gone, just to hear them in his voice and to read the whole arc of them. So we all sat down and made a list, and then very unpoetically, I did a spreadsheet of everyone's choices, and it became clear pretty early on that we'd chosen about 60 or 70. That just we'd all chosen. That was there was no way you couldn't have Digging or Postscript or Midterm Break. But then the interesting part came with those last 25 because we all had
A bit of horse trading went on.
a bit of horse trading went on, bit of toing and froing, and it was also just interesting to see who had chosen which poems and why. And you know, a lot of these poems have resonances for us beyond the words on the page. I mean, they exist in and of themselves as poems, but for us, it's also, oh yeah, I know that night drive was on that really hot holiday in France and we'd had a big fight or whatever. So anyway, so that's how we did it. We all chose our favorites and whittled it down, and this was the result.
Well, that's we'd love to have been a fly on the wall for the horse trading and the, and the spreadsheet discussions. But what with the format for this evening, I probably should have said earlier, we're going to chat as we have been about the book itself, but we've also each chosen some poems to read as we go along. And I'm going to ask Catherine to begin with perhaps the greatest hit, the poem we all know and love, and that no anthology can be without, which is, of course, Seamus's Digging.
And Digging, just before Digging is the first poem in the first book, which I still kind of can't believe he wrote this when he was 25 or something. And also just to say, we didn't plan it this way, but the first poem is the first poem from his first book, and the last poem is one that he wrote for my niece 12 days before he died. So it literally, it covers everything. But this is the first one, Digging. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean, rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father, digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug. The shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging. The cold smell of potato mold, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it.
Thank you, and we all, it's just wonderful. I want to turn to you, Mary, because the last line of that poem, I'll dig with it, is often, we all think of it as Seamus's manifesto, his decision to become a writer and not follow the path of his father and grandfather. And Tom Paulin always used to say you could only say that line with a northern accent because it's the only accent that would put the emphasis on it.
That's right. That's right.
So I wanted to ask you a bit about Balaki, and I think one critic has estimated that over 3/4 of Seamus's poems were written within a 10-mile radius of his birthplace, which is just extraordinary. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about what Balaki meant to him.
Well, it meant an enormous amount because a lot of poetry is based on sad childhoods. Seamus's was based on an extraordinarily happy and fulfilled childhood. Right. And in some respect, he never moved away. Mm-hmm. Having said that, I put it on record that I said to him, would you like to go back? He said no. So, I mean, enough. But he did celebrate it, and it was part of the world. Seamus said to me once and to other people, I was born in the Middle Ages, as was I. Anybody who was born during the war, in all the austerity that went on during the war, I mean, in his house and in my house, we made our own bread, we made our own butter, we had our own eggs, our own meat, our own pig. The flax pullers came. It was seasonal. It had gone on for 1,000 years. Right. And he wanted to preserve that. It was quite brave to do in this time of avant-garde poetry and all that. It was more courageous than you would think to continue to dig in the past. And he was the eldest of 9 children, and of course, famously and sadly, the second last child, his 4-year-old brother, was killed crossing the road to see his other brother, who was on the other side of the road. He was killed by a car. And Seamus wrote a poem, Midterm Break, which every child in Ireland knows. And I had heard Adrian Dunbar, who's a well-known actor, read the other day, and he said something quite profound about it. It ends up he lay in his 4-foot boxes in his cot, no gaudy scars, the bumper knocked him clear, a 4-foot box, a foot for every year. And Adrian Dunbar said, it taught fellas, 15-year-olds like me, that it was all right to feel and to have emotions. And I thought, yes, it did. So that, of course, was a huge event within a happy family's life. And his mother never forgot it, and Seamus in fact, I think it was the first poem he ever showed me. Wow. Just after I met him, he wrote that poem and brought it up to me, and I think he wrote it out. Yeah. He hadn't to change anything. But his father was a cattle dealer. They had a farm. His mother stayed at home and was a very strong woman and had 7 sons and 2 daughters. And managed to keep equilibrium going. And so they were a very happy family. They also loved bringing people in. They were a very hospitable family, and they had Cayley nights and all that sort of thing. And I met Seamus 52 years before we parted. And so they were very much part of my life all that time too. Seamus could nearly be called the laureate of the potato. You already heard it in digging and all, and there are several other poems, but this is very specifically about generating potatoes. You had to split them to it, the seed cutters. They seem hundreds of years away. Bruegel, you'll know them if I can get them true. They kneel under the hedge in a half circle. Behind a windbreak, wind is breaking through. They are the seed cutters. The tuck and frill of leaf sprout is on the seed potatoes, buried under that straw. With time to kill, they are taking their time. Each sharp knife goes, lazily halving each root that falls apart in the palm of the hand, a milky gleam, and at the center, a dark watermark. Oh, calendar customs. Under the broom, yellowing over them, compose a frieze with all of us there, our anonymities. Beautiful poem, I think. That's it.
Thank you. That was beautiful. The choices of these poems, these first 2 poems that we heard, of course, take us into Seamus's early childhood and the landscape that meant so much to him. And I wondered, Catherine, if the book itself followed, what kind of arc the book follows, or what kind of themes it picks up on.
Well, it's interesting because when we were wondering how we'd organize it, we sort of thought, we don't really have the authority to start playing around with it, so we'll just go straight chronological order. Right. And we also didn't include the translations, so there's nothing from Beowulf or Sweeney Stray. So we didn't approach it thematically, and I think maybe that's how a literary editor, a poetry editor might have approached it, and I'm not sure how Dad would have. We just went for the safe option. But it was interesting because within that, this whole arc revealed itself, which you will know from curating the exhibition, that you've got these early poems. I mean, it's Say No More, like Digging is the first poem in the first book. There's poems like Bogland, which is about the bogs, and the Tolland Man, which are about these bog bodies in Denmark that he wrote a lot about. But it's all very earthbound. It's the squelch and slap of the peat, as he says. And then as time goes on, and this happened in his work, and I think you begin to see it in the late 80s, but really in Seeing Things, which I think is 89 or 90, there's sort of this move towards the air and the light. And you really see that. There's a one really beautiful poem called The Skylight, dedicated to Mum, about, a skylight window being put against great resistance, I believe, into Dad's
Done while
attic.
he was away at Harvard.
Yeah.
Came back and it was up.
Back, and it was a fait accompli.
But you're right. I'm really glad you said that, because the exhibition, we had the same feeling that we wanted to follow the chronology, because the chronology is so convincing and it's there for a reason. But we also wanted to trace some of the themes that are more circular. And so the exhibition's organised through the elements. So we start in earth. Then we move into fire, which we use the poem The Forge to symbolise creativity. And there we were able to show lots of drafts and notebooks, and just to show that kind of magical process of the writer behind the curtain. How do they do it? How do they come up with their ideas? And then it moves into water. So thinking about journeys, and also about Heaney as a public figure, a political figure. And of course, as Ron said in his introduction, Seamus Heaney, occupied an extraordinary place in Irish cultural life. We always like to think that we value our writers and our poets, and we do, but Seamus Heaney had a sort of beyond that. He became a figure at a time really when everyone had lost confidence in the church, in the state, in the financial institutions. Who did we turn to? We turned to our poet, and he was just an extraordinary figure. So much so that when he died, there was an amazing tribute at the semi-final of the Dublin-Kerry football match, GAA football match, and it was the day after his death, and it was announced, and they had a minute's silence in the stadium of 80,000 people. And at the end of it, the whole stadium got to their feet in applause, and it was just so wonderful and moving.
It was one of the most moving things of that
And
whole
you have to
day.
salute Ireland for doing it.
You have to salute Ireland for that.
Not every football crowd would rise to their feet for a poet.
I can't think of many other places where it would happen exactly.
But they did, and it was
It
extraordinary.
was amazing. But the thread that we had throughout the exhibition too, and so we do end and air, but the thread was inspired by the poem I'm going to read next, which was this idea of listening and paying attention. And both the exhibitions, the one here at Emory, which was called The Music of What Happens, we wanted to pick up on that idea of listening with the title of Listen Now Again. And it's the last three words of this poem that I'm going to read, The Rain Stick. And this is what inspired the title of the exhibition. The Rain Stick, for Beth and Rand. Upend the rain stick, and what happens next is a music that you never would have known to listen for. In a cactus stalk, downpour, sluice rush, spillage, and backwash come flowing through. You stand there like a pipe being played by water. You shake it again lightly, and diminuendo runs through all its scales like a gutter stopping trickling. And now here comes a sprinkle of drops out of the freshened leaves. Then subtle little wets off grasses and daisies. Then glitter drizzle, almost breaths of air. Upend the stick again. What happens next is undiminished for having happened once, twice, 10, 1,000 times before. Who cares if all the music that transpires is the fall of grit or dry seeds through a cactus? You are like a rich man entering heaven through the ear of a raindrop. Listen now again. That was all right. So I think it's interesting for people to hear, as you said, Catherine, that it wasn't until Seeing Things that your dad said, he waited till he was nearly 50 to credit Marvels. And so there's this sort of sense of the miraculous and of the uplift of the later work. And could you talk a little bit about how those last 25 those poems came together?
Well, I mean, I suppose there were the obvious choices in each volume, and now I'm reaching, going, what were the last 25? But you know, even just things like the last poem, or the second last poem, which was in fact the last poem in his final volume. Mm-hmm. So the last poem in this is the one he wrote just a couple of weeks before. But it's a kite for Avine, for another one of my nieces, his granddaughters. So I think, yes, I think there was this movement towards air, towards something lighter. I mean, I don't think it necessarily consciously coincided with something like the end of the Troubles.
No, I don't think it was a life thing. I think it was just getting older and realizing how lucky he had been. But he had also said once to me that in his early poems, he wanted the light to come through stained glass and light up the poems. But from then on, he wanted it to come in through bright light. And he always quoted Robert Lowell, why not say what happened? And he did then become more direct, and there's less, as I say, quiddity, where he was able to describe things so you could almost touch them. Right. And there's certainly, I think it's more intellectual, more visionary than the earlier work. Right. But someone also made an interesting point. He was an extraordinarily benign presence. Mm-hmm. And that coloured his writing. Now that he's gone, you realise that there's a lot of quite dark poetry there. Yes. You know, his work was actually darker than you could believe when he was standing around. Yeah. So I thought that was an interesting point, and you know.
That's true. I mean, there's been such without Seamus to kind of mediate between us and the poems, we see them in a very different way.
You do see them,
And you also, I think, you know, exactly as you're saying, he was such a benign presence. And as the years went on, he wasn't just a poet, he became this sort of public figure who was called upon to comment about things, you know, momentous things like the Good Friday Agreement or the end of the Troubles or whatever. But, you know, he's... But anyway.
Yeah. Well, that leads me to, I think, my favourite, or certainly I think your dad loved it as well, the Clonmacnoise poem. So this is a poem which wonderfully sort of bridges the two elements, the water and air, and something really magical transpires, not just in the telling of the story, but in the poem itself. And Catherine's going to read Lightnings.
It's called Lightnings 8. It's from this series of 12-line poems that he did. The annals say, when the monks of Clonmacnoise were all at prayers inside the oratory, a ship appeared above them in the air. The anchor dragged along behind so deep it hooked itself into the altar rails, and then, as the big hull rocked to a standstill, a crewman shinned and grappled down the rope and struggled to release it, but in vain. This man can't bear our life here and will drown, the abbot said, unless we help him. So they did. The freed ship sailed, and the man climbed back out of the marvellous as he had known it.
Thank you. That phrase, out of the marvellous, was, of course, the title of this wonderful film made by Shirley McCarthy for Seamus's 70th birthday, and it's just an extraordinary thing to watch. It's fantastic. I was staying with that monastic theme. I want to bring in Ireland's other patron saint, who's not as well known as our 17th of March, St. Patrick, and in fact, I think we can credit Mary and Catherine with the revival of St. Bridget. From could you tell us a little bit about that event at the embassy? In the London embassy, was it?
Yes, in the London. St. Bridget is one of the three patron saints of Ireland. Patrick, Bridget. One grave, three saints do fill: Patrick, Bridget, and Columkill. They're all buried in Downpatrick, and the three patron saints of Ireland. And Bridget is an extraordinary figure because she's a pan-Celtic goddess whom the Christians Christianized, and she was an actual abbess, and she was an extraordinary one. But there are wonderful stories about her that are half Christian, half pre-Christian, and which you can find in Over Nine Waves, my
Now
advertising.
about to be translated into Chinese.
But we, on St. Bridget's Day, Catherine and I were, and this was thanks to the Irish Embassy, Adrian O'Neill, had arranged that we go on Today programme, 10 million listeners in BBC, to talk about St. Bridget and to talk about Seamus as well. And so we read, the St. Bridget poem was read, and they got a lot of hits about it.
That's
fantastic. In the poem, he relates one of the legends I've mentioned about Bridget, yeah.
Would you read it for us?
I will, yeah.
There you go.
This is called The Clothes Shrine, and clearly it's a love poem to me, and it's a love poem to Bridget, and it was written, it's about, as you can hear, the very early days of our marriage, but it was written much later, which I find very reassuring. And it's called The Clothes Shrine. It was a whole new sweetness in the early days to find light white muslin blouses on a see-through nylon line, drip drying in the bathroom, or a nylon slip in the shine of its own electricity. As if St. Bridget once more had rigged up a ray of sun, like the one she'd strung on air to dry her own cloak on. Hard-pressed Bridget, so unstoppably on the go. The damp and slump and unfair drag of the work-a-day made light of and got through, as usual, brilliantly.
Poem about St. Bridget it brings me to one of my favourite letters, which we have in Listen Now Again in the exhibition in Dublin, is a letter that Heaney wrote to Brian Friel, his great friend Brian Friel, and he wrote it on St. Bridget's Day, the 1st of February 1980, which is the Feast of St. Bridget, and it's about taking his stick and going for a walk on the Strand for the first time in years, he says, and he refers back to the first exchange of letters that they had after the publication of Death of a Naturalist in 1966, and he says it reminds him of how blessed we all are to know each other. And then he goes on, and this is just wonderful. He says, I suppose the sense of being on the cusp of something is working in me, not just because of the weather and the saint calendar, but because Michael is going off tomorrow. Jobless, courageous, and a tremble with anxiety, although the latter condition is dissembled quite well. Or do I mean concealed? At any rate, the words came into my head out on the Strand. My father and mother are dead. I'm 50, and my son is leaving home. Old hat to a Methuselah like you, I know, but cubs like me are just getting into the range of the evacuated spaces. So that amazingly beautiful letter about his son leaving home, being 50 on the Strand, also that phrase evacuated spaces, really meant a lot to us when we were thinking about what space Heaney represents, not just in Irish culture but in the world, and what it meant to kind of think about his poems in different kinds of spaces. So with the exhibition here, and then particularly with Listen Now Again, it feels just wonderful to have this oasis, this place in a bank where poetry has probably been ever heard, where people can just go. It's free, that's the other thing. You do have to get your ticket to Dublin, but it's free when you get there. So it just kind of really speaks again to how valued and beloved Seamus was. So I also wanted to read the poem about the Clothes Shrine. Reminded me of one of my favourite poems that in fact isn't in 100 poems. So I found one.
It was one of the the trades
that we had to explain to people why they weren't in.
But we're going to give you a special dispensation to read it.
So I'm allowed to read from one of the collections. This poem is one of the clearances, elegies that Seamus wrote for his mother after her death in 1985. And I love this poem because I first heard him read it in Ballymena when I was a teenager, and it's a poem about folding sheets with his mother. And he said she got the sheets in the Fair Hill in Ballymena, which was where I was from, and the ripped up flour sacks. And so he read it in a room, and everyone in the room suddenly, it just brought them right into the poem, because they knew where he was talking about and where the sheets had been bought. And I was asked to go and teach some Heaney in my daughter's school when we were living in Dublin, and I brought in a sheet and asked the kids to stand up and fold it, and they had clearly never done it in their lives. so it helped them to get a sense of what the poem was trying to do. The cool that came off sheets just off the line made me think the damp must still be in them. But when I took my corners of the linen and pulled against her, first straight down the hem and then diagonally, then flapped and shook the fabric like a sail in a crosswind, they made a dried out, undulating thwack. So we'd stretch and fold and end up hand to hand for a split second, as if nothing had happened. For nothing had that had not always happened beforehand, day by day, just touch and go, coming close again by holding back, in moves where I was X and she was O, inscribed in sheets she'd sewn from ripped out flour sacks.
Lovely poem. A note about the flour sacks, because I remember them.
Oh, is that right?
This was post-war austerity when there was nothing. It wasn't poverty, particularly, that made sheets. Nothing was available. But I remember one, they were a stone, big bag, and there was a rising sun and a blackbird, and they were called the early riser.
Oh, fantastic.
Seemed suitable for a sheet to be made from early risers.
And it's also true. I mean, we didn't include it in our list, but Ireland did. Ireland was asked to vote for its favourite poem of the last 100 years in 2014, and thousands of entries came in. Then they were whittled down to a short list, and everybody voted. And Seamus's poem, When All the Others Were Away at Mass, was voted Ireland's favourite poem.
Part of that same sequence.
Part of the same sequence, yeah.
More potatoes.
More potatoes.
Should we read it as well?
Yeah, I think you should read it.
Should we read it?
Yeah, you read it, Catherine.
Do you want to?
No, you do.
Okay. Where is it? You see,
It begins when all the others were away at Mass. And it wasn't that Seamus didn't go to Mass. He and his mother had gone to the early Mass, and they were going to second Mass.
Okay, so this is Clearances 3. When all the others were away at Mass, I was all hers as we peeled potatoes. They broke the silence, let fall one by one like solder weeping off the soldering iron. Cold comforts set between us, things to share gleaming in a bucket of clean water. And again let fall. Little pleasant splashes from each other's work would bring us to our senses. So while the parish priest at her bedside went hammer and tongs at the prayers for the dying, and some were responding and some crying, I remembered her head bent towards my head, her breath in mine, our fluent dipping knives, never closer the whole rest of our lives.
Amazing poem.
It is a
absolutely
beauty.
amazing poem.
It's a
Yes,
beautiful poem.
I mean, one of the really extraordinary things as well, working with Heaney's archive, was seeing poems that were so familiar, like this one, and seeing the changes that had happened along the way. I mean, one of my favourite changes happened to the poem Bogland, which, we know sort of introduces the whole sort of era of the bog poems and the poems that are so earthy. And he has the line that became soft as pulp, initially was soft as banana.
And you just go, yeah, no.
Because banana is just a funny word. You can't put that in there.
It's true. And actually, I must also say, because it's a direct connection back to Emory, the exhibition you curated here in 2014, when I came to it, I noticed that the first line of that poem I've just read was, when the other woman was away at Mass, which was his Aunt Mary. But, it's been fascinating seeing these drafts, which I have to be honest, I don't know that well. The scholars and the academics know them, and Geraldine has sort of opened them up like a sort of magician with a deck of cards, sort of for everyone to see. And it really is fascinating to see that kind of life cycle of a poem, that they don't always, I think, rarely emerge fully formed.
Well, on that note, the poem that we chose that we thought we'd like to end with had a really significant change. This poem is many people's favorite poems, and we're all glad it definitely made it. And no doubt that it was going to make it into 100 poems. It's the poem Postscript, and you will hear, Catherine's going to read it, you'll hear in the last line, the famous last line is, "And catch the heart off guard and blow it open." And in the drafts, right up until it reaches publication, in fact, after it was published in the Irish Times, Seamus takes his pen and strikes out, "blow it open," and change it to "swing it open." And he goes back and forth between swing and blow, and then settles on the much better one, blow.
Much better.
Much better one,
Yeah.
yes. So,
Well, and as we said, Mum was one of his you were his first reader and most stringent editor.
I was his first reader, and it's a shaky business because they have often moved on and you haven't, and conversations, I would read it. What do you not like about it? I didn't, before I had said a word, what do you not like? So it was quite a trial to do it, But I did English as my subject, but he had so many amazing, like Ron and Helen Wendler and everyone, so I wasn't a critic as such, but he did pay me a good compliment. He said, "You put a poem between your teeth, as someone would put a coin to see is it right." And I thought, all right, that'll do. That'll do. So sometimes I was frequently wrong, as well. Yeah.
So we're going to end with the poem Postscript, and then we've just a very few minutes, but a few minutes for some questions. But we're still planning to let you leave when you at 8 o'clock, so you can buy some books. So we'll end with Catherine reading Postscript.
Appropriately named Postscript. And sometime make the time to drive out west into County Clare, along the flaggy shore in September or October, when the wind and the light are working off each other, so that the ocean on one side is wild with foam and glitter, and inland among stones, the surface of a slate-grey lake is lit by the earth lightning of a flock of swans, their feathers ruffed and ruffling, white on white, their fully grown, headstrong-looking heads tucked or cresting or busy underwater. Useless to think you'll park and capture it more thoroughly. You are neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass, as big soft buffetings come at the car sideways and catch the heart off guard and blow it open.